Okay, we'll start. Hello, everyone. Okay, one second. Yeah, we can go now. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on the last Friday evening of the year. My name is Anvesha. I work at Hasgeek, and we're hosting the session to discuss, the Telecom Act, which received the president's assent just a couple of days back on the 24th of December. So today we'll broadly sort of discuss its impacts on business, compliance, and also users. Today, the speakers are Sunil Bajpai, the Chief Trust Officer at Chanla Platforms Limited, Pragya Mishra, the Director of Public Affairs at Truecaller, Dr. Mahesh Uppal, Director at Comfirst India, and Rishu Mehrotra, the Technology Leader at Merkle Science. And the discussion today will be moderated by Isha Suri, Research Lead at the Center for Internet and Society. So for those who are new here, a bit about Hasgeek and Rootconf. Hasgeek essentially is, building communities around tech and topics related to tech. So we have Fifth Elephant that's on AI related topics, and Rootconf which is on systems and architecture. And so also under Rootconf we we tend to discuss policies and how policies affect companies and businesses, in terms of compliance and regulations. So this discussion is also a part of that sort of initiative to bring in these policy conversations within the tech community. And with that, I'll hand it over to Isha. Over to you.
Hi, thanks, Anvesha, and also thank you for coordinating and getting all of us together. Wouldn't have been possible without you. Anvesha has really laid the context. I'd just like to take 2 minutes of your time to just talk you through about how we've planned the session. Uh, Earlier last week, the Parliament cleared the Telecommunications Bill 2023, and it's been touted as a bill that's set to replace what we call the colonial era laws, the Indian Telegraph Act of 1885, the Indian Wireless Telegraphy Act. Out here we have speakers, and I just want to spend a bit of time to understand, and it's drawn a lot of mixed reactions, if I may say, from diverse stakeholders, right? And even within those stakeholder groups, be it business, be it civil society, or be it users in general. We're going to spend some more time, I think, focusing also on what the business perspective or the business cost of these regulations is going to be about. Uh, and then any sort of regulatory intervention comes at the cost of innovation, quote unquote. And we would like to spend a bit of time on understanding whether these new laws that we see are going to be enacted, do we see that also happening? Or do we think that that's not going to happen with the ways that the bill has been enacted, and whether all the stakeholder concerns and the process that went into making these laws sort of ensures that these don't come at the cost of innovation and security. The way we're going to do this is like, I want to give 3 minutes of opening remarks to each of these of our panelists, just to understand what your first feelings about the bill are, right? And usually I think any policy or any regulation has both pros and cons. And we just want to understand from you that what do you think about them in your first reading and what your understanding about it is. And then we'll probably delve deeper into a few thematic areas that we've identified. Without further ado, I think everybody wants to hear the experts and not me. I'd hand it over to Dr. Uppal. What are your first reactions about the bill?
Well, I would say that the first reactions are positive with a few provisos. I do believe that they have addressed 2 or 3 fairly important issues as far as the industry was concerned, which is namely, for instance, the role of, for example, OTT services in the larger communications space by kind of, and I'll come back to that also, by kind of excluding them, but not quite. And the second thing is, of course, about satellite communications, which is seemed to be stuck because of an earlier Supreme Court judgment on spectrum, which, as you recall, was about mandatory auction of spectrum, and which was effectively law, which now would no longer be the law. And that certainly will provide a certain level of flexibility to the allocation of spectrum, which was much needed because there is much more to spectrum than simply spectrum used by mobile operators, and so on and so forth. I'll come back to that. Now, so clearly there were two or three sticky issues which seem to have been settled for the time being. Now, clearly this also would mean that the players who were expecting it to be resolved differently would not be particularly happy. So I suspect that the mobile operators, for example, are not particularly happy with the current situation. Now, that is at the level of, immediacy. Now, do I believe that this is something path-breaking? I believe not. I do not think it is path-breaking for the simple reason that, as you pointed out, Isha, this act replaces a colonial era act. And what was really colonial about that act was that it was top-down command and control. And that part, sadly, has been very much retained in the new act. So we don't see much from the point of view of the citizenry of this country that would suggest anything but a revival of some kind of top-down governance. I think the fact that many of the new obligations or new powers that the government has sought to acquire, whether it is in the interception of messages, whether it is to do with standard setting with its implications for encryption and so on and so forth. All of those seem to lack, in my humble opinion, sufficient safeguards that would make them citizen-friendly. So to that extent, this is not something that I'm entirely happy about. But my last point would be that, again, unfortunately, but that is the reality, that most of our legislation or even policy formulation seems to have been short-term. And I've been in the sector long enough to point out some examples. For example, the National Telecom Policy of #94 talked about the entry of private players in the telecom sector, but it had a half a line about the creation of the regulatory body. In fact, it didn't even talk about the creation of a regulatory body. It just mentioned that some kind of arrangements would have to be made about fair competition. Similarly, the 99 policy took care of the controversies at that time, which was which were mainly related to the litigation, etc., that was going on between, actually, ironically, the government and the regulatory body itself. And so the National Telecom Policy and the subsequent amendment of the Act, the TRAI Act in this case, settled that. Similarly, the 2018 policy also attempted something, but it looked like heralding a new era, but we haven't seen much follow after 6 years of that policy, 5.5, 6 years. So I think we should credit the government with having resolved, or at least some of the challenges facing the players in the moment and reduce the level of uncertainty in the sector. But in as far as a legislation should actually try and, in my humble opinion, do two things. One is to focus on how best to make telecommunications technologies available in the widest sense to the largest number of people to the betterment of their lives, etc. You don't get that sense from this act that is. The second thing, given that telecommunications is a very, very resource-centric and very, very capital-intensive sector, I think what it needed was a strong flavor of creating an investment-friendly environment, basically to attract investments. And the third, and that'll be my last point, third, that today, given that the government no longer is the operator of last resort, given the status of the public sector companies, it was actually very, very important for the legislation to not only deal with how to make the sector investment friendly, etc., but also how to regulate private players. So it needed to have a focus on promotion of competition, the promotion of investment, promotion of competition, and of course, finally, it does do some of that, but again, in my view, limited the protection of the network itself and the protection of consumers. That should have been the end, besides national security, of course. Now, that should have been the focus of this act. My view is that some of it deals with, the rest it is rather weak on, and I'll forgive them in the sense that our history shows that we are not as forthright and as clear in our formulations of legislation as we might have been, as some of our peers have been. If you look at what some of the new telecommunications legislation elsewhere, particularly in Europe, is about, and to some extent even other countries, that focus on markets, the focus on investment, focus on competition, on expansion of this. That thing is conspicuously lacking in the sector. It seems to be more focused on solving immediate problems, where I think I would say it has done not spectacularly, but fairly. I'll stop here.
Right, thanks. I think not spectacularly, but fairly seems to be the theme of how we're going to be proceeding with this session. But thank you. I'll come back to you. I have a lot of questions. I hope we have enough time to cover them. Over to you, Pragya. I mean, as somebody who represents the private sector, if I may take the liberty to say so, like, what are your initial reactions about the regulations? Also, because it comes with it, any sort of legislation will come with it challenges of compliance. So also, maybe if you could shed some light about what your initial thoughts have been.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for having me. And, I think Dr. Uppal has really, set the context as we had expected very well. And so it lays a good foundation for me to build on. I think in general, I feel like, the bill has been, fairly balanced. I think some elements of what we had suggested as industry in the last draft, some of those inclusions have taken place. One of them obviously being the fact that we, everyone felt that OTT services should be kept out of the purview. And I think, while Dr. Uppal says for the time being, I think we'll take that relief for the moment and see how that really plays out. I think also, just generally, I feel like it's balanced and also has some amount of rationalization. I think the other element also to mention is that, I think there were a lot of terms like, licensing and license, which were there in the earlier version. Now it's taken a more balanced and a more, I would say, toned down version, which is, authorization. And, I think that just seems to suggest a more lighter touch kind of regulation. And I think generally, I think that always allows for industry to think and have much more flexibility. And also, to your point about in the beginning when you said around innovation, right? I think if it's light touch, then it just allows for general innovation to take place with, of course, certain elements of safety being kept in mind. I think as the bill was also being presented, the minister did talk about the enormity of the telecom sector more broadly, and obviously, the penetration that it has. I mean, I think rural India still requires much more penetration to take place, but at least urban India is seeing a lot of traction. And I think what that means is really for apps like us, there's going to be a lot of proliferation of many more digital applications, and therefore much more faster digital inclusion, at least in these areas, and much more use of digital technology, but I think is really where the future is, and I think another element which really screamed out for me was really the aspect around safety, and I think that is where Truecaller really comes in, right? I think our role is and our mission is fundamentally deeply rooted in making sure digital communication is safe for our users. Now in India we have about 260 million users, globally around 360 370 million users. On an average, we identify about 41 billion spam calls, and also we make sure that to improve communication with our customers, we've also verified about 3,000 businesses and Indian startups. So, I think just keeping that in mind, the aspect around safety, where there's a whole chapter around user protection, which has been really put out, that I think has many elements. Of course, much more can be done. To Dr. Uppal's point, I don't think that very exhaustive and covers every. It's a step in the right direction, and we've obviously have been reading the bill. And I think the earlier thoughts that we have is that just the fact that OTTs is out certainly gives us some breathing space. What the cost of compliance will be, as you were asking, I think we are yet to see that. We are still in the stage of analyzing a lot of this. Of course, there will be a compliance. Just step back and see the whole picture. It's not just the telecom bill. Now we're also going to be having the Data Protection Act, which just took place, and now we'll have the rules coming out. So all of this, it's like raining regulation this season. So I think it's just a lot of that. We'll have to take a step back and look at compliance costs from an overall point of view of doing business in India, and what does that really look like. Since we're a Swedish headquarters, we have other geographies as well, with India being obviously our largest country. But I think just stepping back, all of that will have to be contextualized with not just the telecom bill, which I think does not impact us that much, but just more broadly, even the Data Protection Act. So yeah, just some opening thoughts on where we are on this.
Great. Thanks, Pragya. I think that helps also a lot. I think reigning regulations is what it is. Interesting times for sure. I'm going to come back to you also because I think it'll be good for our even people who are watching us. And for me, particularly, I'd like to hear more about how we're looking at definition of telecommunication services, because personally, I found some of the things particularly vague. I think I would side with what Dr. Uppal said, excludes, but not quite. We're going to tease that out a bit. But I'll quickly move to Mr. Vajpayee. In general, what are your initial thoughts? And also feel free to jump in on any of the points that Dr. Uppal and Pragya have sort of raised, and we can take this forward. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ishan. I quite agree with most of the points that Dr. Uppal made or Pragya made. Simplified licensing is a good thing. Non-auction route for allocation of spectrum is extremely important. I mean, all spectrum cannot be only auction. That it's infeasible. So that opens that possibility. And consumer protection, like Pragya mentioned. At least we now have a law which says that you cannot spam. We didn't have any law which said that you couldn't in this country. You could. It was not illegal. Now it is. So there are things which are in this law which are friendly and which are required for protection of arms. Both speakers have, of course, touched on many points, many of which would require a debate to reach a more nuanced understanding. So we get to it when we discuss it further. But I want to say one simple point before moving on. I don't see any problems that we see. All of us see. I also see some problems coming in future. I don't see those problems as creations of the act itself. The problems are in the nature of the beast. Okay. Now you may think that the act could have done more. It could have clarified certain things which it has left unclear. My take would be it could have clarified, but you may not have liked the clarification. Then, right? There are people who have to. They are on both sides of the divide, right? So if you don't like the clarification, then what do you do? Now the door for discussion is open, right? People, experts, lawyers, everybody will debate. Everybody will offer their opinions, and this discussion is what will clarify how the law gets implemented. Right? The act is in effect, but its implication and impact will take time. Will require interpretations, guidelines, notifications from the government, what not. Right? So that will be influenced by debate. That's a good thing. Rather than to have something which says this is shut and no further debate, very clear, but wrong, right? It's better than that to leave the door open for discussion, to indicate what you want. And you see, a colonial era act has survived for more than 100 years, right? Because things changed slowly over this period of time. Now things are changing rapidly. Look at what AI has done, how things are changing. You don't even know from where the threat arrives and where the threat is. How can you legislate for all of it in the law itself and declare it today? I think it's an impossible task. So this balancing act, in my opinion, has been done well. Certain things have been left unstated, and it's okay. And discussion can resolve those questions, which I think is a better way than to demand certainty and clarity. And we'll get to those things as we discuss further. So I will hold my breath for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bajpai. I sure hope that the door is still open for the discussion, because otherwise all of this will be an exercise in futility. But I certainly understand what you're saying. It's complicated, the nature of the beast, and future-proof regulations are hard, and it's sort of hard work. But yeah, as long as there is a room for discourse and debate, and for each stakeholder probably to sort of weigh in, I think that's a win-win for democracy any day. Over to you, Rishu. What are your sort of initial thoughts about the bill, the hits and the misses?
Yeah. Hey, so first up, I hope I'm audible because I'm on the move. All right.
Yes,
perfect.
you are. Loud and clear.
Thanks. Yeah. So I think my fellow panelists have kind of covered most of the points that are there, right? Well, as a technocrat, there are a few things that would particularly interest me from an implementation perspective of this. Before that, quickly touching base upon the bill as a, as what it is, a bill, and probably, a document with a lot of, legalese around it. It'll never be perfect, no matter how many iterations you usually go through. I agree with Sunil that, look, with the kind of world that we are kind of entering in, with AI becoming more commonplace, telecommunications, the nature of what telecommunications meant even 10 years ago or 15 years ago is completely different from what it is today, right? So yes, it is going to be, we have to be braced for the way things change, right? Even when European Union went ahead and they had certain data protection, laws and rules that were implemented, they weren't really very simple to implement. Like a lot of us who would have worked on it know how intricate some of the legalese, how intricate some of the terms and conditions were there. right? So it's always a mixed bag. It'll continue to remain a mixed bag. It's heartening to see that some of the things such as allocation versus auctioning has been modified. It opens up the way for some of the newer players, international players also to kind of come into the mix. Always a good thing. Like I said, as a technocrat, I would love to see more and more new players on the technology front come in. What I am not really sure is when the Pragya mentioned at some point in time, right, that this is going to become one huge compliance circus altogether, that you're going to run around saying, okay, are you compliant? This is what you need to do. Compliant. What as a technocrat, again, what's very very interesting, or what's very curious for me to see, is how quickly organizations are going to adapt to this. Right, as and when newer and newer things are going to come up from debates and discussions and modifications and amendments, anything that goes around it, how easy is it for us, organizations at technology level, to really adapt? The cost of doing business, the ease of doing business, as Pragya mentioned. Proliferation remains a very interesting standpoint for me, because I remember an earlier discussion around the bill, and I said this could be as revolutionary as the financial inclusion exercise, seeds of which was sown very, very early, mid of 2000s, and then we saw what the payments industry has become today. I would probably take a very strong bet and say that this is start of something similar. Like, it has the power to kind of change things at the level at which we envisioned payments a few years back and the way we see it today. But yeah, I mean, again, good to see changes are made. I think I echo the sentiments of fellow panelists. As a technocrat, again, always good to see new players coming in, new technology coming in, and seeing, yeah, how does that really work in terms of transformations.
Thanks, Ishu. I just want to come back to also Dr. Ripple. I mean, I think you made a very interesting point where you say that they exclude OTTs, but not quite. That's the way that's the sense I also got, because I think the phrasing is too wide and vague, and I think enough has been said about it. And secondly, when you read that along with the penal provisions, right, like failure to comply, and that could lead to imprisonment and a fine. So then there's a risk of also over compliance. You just err on the side of caution. You just don't want to not comply. And so the way I would see it from this side of the fence is that businesses, or there will be players who would be worried unless and until it is explicitly stated. Uh, so is my understanding, and I'm guessing a lot of others also out there would have this question, and how are you reading it as an expert and someone who's astutely followed, I think, that the Indian Telecom's journey. And secondly, I think Rishu also mentioned this point that he, as a technocrat, sees a lot of players entering. But again, from this side of the fence, I feel like when there is ambiguity in law and there is lack of regulatory predictability, you will not at least see a lot of newer entrants entering the market, because telecom, as we know, is anyway a natural monopoly. It requires it's an infrastructure intensive sort of a space, right? Do you also see that happening, or do you think that the bill takes care of some of these things, and maybe people like me are just panicking for no reason whatsoever?
No, you should try sort of steer this a little bit to the center. As far as the OTT players are concerned, the legislation in its words certainly does not exclude OTTs because of the definition of messaging, the definition of telecommunications. It is true that the minister has very explicitly said that OTT players will now will continue to be covered by the Information Technology Act. But having said that, there are two things. One is, of course, why was it not considered necessary to explicitly exclude the OTT players? And especially since it is the law that will be enforced, not a ministerial statement. Because this has arisen in telecoms many times, that even policy statements are not actually enforceable in courts of law. It has to be the law itself, right? So that is one part of it. I do think the minister has kind of allayed a certain kind of fear that, the OTT players might need licensing and stuff like that, which I believe I have more reasons to take the minister on at face value and say, yes, I think that may not happen. And I think the government probably has seen the challenge that something like that would actually pose for the licensing or authorization regime as that. So that is a good. I think that probably will not happen. But if you look at, for example, the penal provisions that you spoke about, it is difficult to see them without including the OTT players in them. Because, for example, if you're talking about interception, if you're talking about encryption, if you're talking now, it would be crazy to say that, some voice will be subject to this, but some other voice will not be subject to this act. And so whether we like it or not, this is going to create some level of discord somewhere and some level of, if not controversy, at least some debate. And resolving it, as Sunil also pointed out, is something that is a major challenge. And the government may have taken the easy route by just leaving it unsaid. But that, just to belabor the point, that will not, as the historians say, the questions will not go away. The problems will remain. I mean, whether or not this bill addresses them or not, the problems will go away. So I think the issues relating to the penal provision are very difficult to see without including the OTT, without inferring that the government has the OTT players also in mind. Whether in practice it did, I mean, I'm not, I'm just saying to an outsider what it looks like. Now, as far as I take some issue with Sunil on the whole business of spam, right? Now, and in fact, I'll take issue with many people who would say that this bill actually will change many things. My sense is that it clarifies certain things, but it won't change much for two reasons. One is that as it is, I mean, today there are still already penalties in place, whether or not through this legislation or otherwise, for spam. And the fact is that it is the enforcement of those that is the challenge, not the definition of spam, right? I mean, I think all of us know what spam is, and we also know what the workarounds for those who are spammers, what kind of workarounds exist for them and how they survive, and how all of us, despite all the rules and all the penal provisions, etc., continue to be inflicted by spam on a daily basis, multiple number of times. So I think that is not changing simply because it is now illegal to do so. And we hope so, but because the enforcement challenges would. Now, as far as the new players is concerned that Rishu was talking about, again, I would take a more realistic view. The fact is, India's sector is sufficiently vibrant to be able to attract all kinds of players, and we have seen phenomenal innovation in this sector. We have seen any number of players, both international and local players, the startup economy, etc. Not much was prevented by, none of this was prevented even by the Colonial Act, nor do I expect this to change in the short term. I don't see any explicit measure in the Act which will make this that much easier to do. I think what is good about the Act is that it's easy reading. It actually uses some very important language, I think, which is useful. For example, I mean, this whole business of authorization. Now, it because eventually a license is also an authorization. It's kind of amusing that in India we had got it ulta, that license was supposed to be the higher level of compliance, requiring higher levels of compliance, but an authorization was just informing the regulator. But I mean, if you look at, let's say, the history of the authorization directive in the EU, it was the overall, it was the central point from which everything else followed. And it said that, some kinds of services could be licensed individually, for example, those that required spectrum and stuff like that. But everything was authorization. And after all, license is an authorization after all. But I think we still don't know how the government will implement this authorization. Will something change? Will the cost, will the levies change? Will it be, for example, will the mobile operators now have lower levies to pay? For example, currently, the telecom sector, mobile operators, certainly, the license players pay roughly 30% of their revenues back to the government, of which about 18 are GST, but 11 to 12%. This is a huge telecom tax, right? Now, will something change on that front? We don't know. The Act doesn't. I mean, I would have loved to see, for example, a line in the Act that says that given the importance of telecommunications to the country's economy and its people, the government will seek to ensure that the costs of providing telecom services are minimal, right? That it will aim to reduce the cost, the additional regulatory costs of providing, telecom services. In other words, with much of which has happened elsewhere. Now, all that I'm not seeing. For example, same thing. There is today no prior permission required to provide the vast majority of services across all major regulatory regimes. You do not require prior permission even. In most cases, you have to inform the regulator that you're providing these services, but that's about it, right? Now, I would have liked to see some of that kind of language in the bill to say that, like, we are wedded to a vibrant telecommunications sector. We want to reduce the costs of providing these services, given what the implications are, and given, for example, what UPI has demonstrated, that huge value can be delivered if we reduce certain kinds of costs. All that has not happened. But I'm not worried too much about innovation per se, because that's happening. I don't think the innovators are deterred by these things. They would probably be incentivized more if certain other things are there in the bill. But I am not worried on the innovation front at all.
Great, that helps. Pragya, over to you. I mean, I noticed that you sort of said that at this point in time, at least the industry is sort of looking at OTTs being excluded. Is it because of the way you're reading and analyzing the bill in itself, or is it the statement and the sort of message that the government sort of given out? And the other point I also wanted to just quickly talk to you about is, like, you also talked about GDPR, you talked about the Data Protection Act and the rules sort of being coming in. And do you sort of see them at odds? Do you see that there'll be any sort of tension between the Telecommunications Bill 2023? Because there have been critiques that it does sort of impinge on the fundamental right to privacy by virtue of some of the provisions that are there in the bill. So how are you reading it, and what's your take on them?
Yeah. So I think, a lot of our thinking obviously has come with the way we're reading the bill, and I think also the clarification around what the minister said. And I agree with Dr. Uppal that, if there is a clarification which is put on the record in terms of, in some sort of a notification or an additional, amendment of some sorts, then it also helps in making sure we can fall back on it if at all there is any other any other legal challenges that might emerge from there, right? So I think, of course, while he said it in the press, and obviously we have a relief, but it'll be nice if it can be somewhere be weaved into the law itself, if possible, so that we have something to fall back on. But I think, like I said, I think just the broad definition of telecommunication services, I think earlier, if you look at the 2022 version, obviously included OTTs and emails and a lot of other categories. But, the final act, has removed specific references to OTT services. And I think, it can be interpreted differently, but this is what our reading has been on this. And I think there has been a lot of feedback from different stakeholders in the ecosystem for that to happen. I think the definition, like I said, remains broad, but we do believe that the fact that the IT Act is something that's going to continue to be to have OTTs being governed. I think that's a relief for us, because we also, as talking about innovation, you don't want too many regulators. You don't want all the time just looking at compliances or receiving notices and not knowing where and what category do you fall under. So I think the easier way for obviously industry to function is that you have one regulator mostly to be able to report to. Of course, if you're a fintech player and you're obviously in more horizontal sectors, you might have multiple regulators, but at least the core of it, that it's going to be under the IT Act. So I think from that point of view, we do feel like we have been in some way removed from this. And I think to your point around privacy, I think that the fact that there has been a lot of emphasis on user verification, some emphasis even on biometric verification data in the bill itself. And I think there are going to be some concerns on one side, which is, it's good, because I think a lot of the frauds that are taking place is really happening at the baseline, at retail counters where multiple SIMs are being, given out without any sort of right level of verification taking place. That's at least what we have seen. If you see more recently, the DOT under their digital intelligence unit and Astra program went and, guided, or rather, sent a request to many of the telecom players to go out and disconnect a lot of these connections where fraud was taking place. So I think some of this is happening, and it also has to do with identity verification at the baseline when these SIMs are given out. While there are rules already, to what Dr. Uppal was saying, but I think the fact that it makes it illegal now is certainly a deterrent in many ways, because one is the implementation might be a little bit slack, but the fact that now it's out and out illegal, I think we have already seen, like I said, the DOT go out and have many of these numbers disconnected and removed completely. So I think one side it's a positive, but the other side also means that when you have this biometric verification, it's obviously a very sensitive data set. It does require to a very large extent some proportionality assessment, prior to, let's say, the collection and the maintenance of this. And therefore, I think the storage element of it needs to be really have very, very high standards. It's obviously already has some amount of, it is some amount of recognized form of verification in already certain regulated sectors like banking, etc. And I think to just include it in this has, I think, in some way also open the doorway for some of this fraud that is taking place to have some accountability back because of some of this verification. I also feel, just broadly, I think prescribing the authentication mechanism, whether that's Aadhaar as an acceptable mode of verification for purposes of Telecom Act has also been mentioned. I don't know, how this will really play out and how is this going to be implemented, but I think generally there are going to be a lot of operational challenges around this in the verification landscape. So safety, I think, is certainly something which will have to be kept really up there. When you are collecting this sort of data sets, you'll have to really make sure that safety and security is of utmost importance, because we've also seen data breaches happen when it came to the health data more recently. So I think there will be some amount of stringency that must be mentioned there for sure. I think, beyond this, from a privacy lens, I feel, I think has to be a fine balance. I don't see any at this point, at least with whatever reading we have, that the Data Protection Act and the Telecom Bill is at odds at each other in any way. Of course, we'll have to wait and see what the rules have to say. But I feel like at least at this point, I don't see any sort of major flags from a privacy lens on this.
Sure, I think that helps, and I also understand where you're coming from with proportionality. I think that's also been one of the concerns, right? Like it does not meet the proportionality requirements as laid down by the Supreme Court. Mr. Vajpayee, I think you sort of just initially hinted at how you'd be delving deeper in round two about how you're reading the bill about definition of telecommunication services. And also, do you think there is a risk of overcompliance, especially because there's a penal provision? I do feel that sort of changes a lot of things. At least my first reading or initial reading of the bill, that's something that jumped at me. So yeah.
Okay, so let's go by definitions first, as you suggest, and then we will address some of the other questions of overcompliance and some of the points that other speakers have made. So the definition of telecommunication is identical in the draft 1 year ago and now. It's the same definition, telecommunication. In simple terms, it says that telecommunication is transmitting a message by electromagnetic means, whether it is wired or wireless. This is what telecommunication is. All that is stated in that definition amounts to this. Okay. So if you are transmitting something by electromagnetic means, it is telecommunications. You could do by other means, then it is not. Okay. Telecommunications service, which is where OTT was mentioned in the draft in 22 and is excluded this time, is a very simple definition. It says telecommunications service is a service for telecommunication. Now, how would you read this? This seems a little circular. Telecommunications service is a service for telecommunication. For what services which are required, like for instance, encryption in the RAN, for implementing a telecommunication piece. Is that what is meant by a service, or is service that is what rides over the telecommunication layer which has already been established? So let me interpret this telecommunication service to mean that it's a service which is offered for communication. Okay, that is directly or indirectly dependent on telecom or the same electromagnetic propagation of signals. Okay, so I'm saying we could read it as telecommunication service as a service offered for communication, that is directly or indirectly. Now, keyword here is directly or indirectly. Okay, if it is directly, then it is like in the good old days of licensed services. Those are the directly services which are directly on the network that is licensed. If it is indirectly also, then it includes all services, and then it would include OTT messaging or whatever you have. However, not everything which is OTT. OTT is itself not a defined term. It's difficult to define term, and there are so many flavors of OTT. The entire internet is an OTT in a sense. I mean, your access to internet is provided by a service provider, and everything else is over on top of that. The entire internet can never be licensed. Who would you license, and who will take that license, and how are you even controlling or governing the people who are providing services over the internet? They are outside your jurisdiction. Some of them are not known. So the entire internet obviously cannot be governed, and everything cannot be licensed. But correctly, like everybody else is also reading, that it doesn't exclude OTT, and therefore the government could notify that this class of services need to take authorization. Okay. Now, if that happens, then that service or that class of service would become, either it must be exempted. Either it must be exempted. If it is not exempted, then it can be required to be authorized or simply forgotten, not mentioned anywhere, then not required. This is what I meant when I said that the door is open for shaping how things will happen, and that is why an informed debate and a true debate and a willingness to engage with the issues is important in those people who are debating. Because if you fail to do that, then you will get bad laws, you will get bad implementation. But if you look at the problem for what it is and whether you can solve it and how much you can help solve it, it then shapes how the rules get formulated, how the policy gets formulated, how even the courts will interpret it. Now, we mentioned in the discussion just now that privacy is a fundamental right. Yes, it is, and I'm glad, and so are all of us glad, that privacy is a fundamental right. But there's another fundamental right called right to life. That's very, very fundamental. It is explicitly stated in the Constitution. Nobody's ever said that it is not a fundamental right. But the state has the power to deprive you of your life by following a due process of law. It has that power, doesn't it? So just to say that something is a fundamental right does not mean that that ends the debate. The debate survives. You can still debate whether we should retain capital punishment or not. And this debate keeps coming up in this country and elsewhere in the world. Some people have decided, some countries have decided capital punishment is not where we want to go. This is illegal. Some others have not made it illegal. Some people will demand capital punishment to be applied in even more cases. It's difficult debate. And when cases are presented, it's difficult to argue one way or the other, in favor of or against. Okay, but people are capable of enormous mischief. They are capable of huge costs to society. Right? We have to keep that in mind. I'm not therefore suggesting that we should take one decision or the other. I'm saying we should find out what are the real issues and whether we can contribute in any way to the solution. Because regulation comes or laws come when what you should be doing, you aren't doing. So you're forced to do it in a way, right? Don't force that. The door is open. There is a statement by nobody less than a cabinet minister that it's not included. So it's not included. That's what I would believe. That's what everybody should believe, that it's not included unless circumstances change. And if that happens, the government will make a declaration. And if that's not right, you can go to the court and you can say that it's against fundamental right to privacy to do such things. Proportionality, etc., can be judged there. Now let's judge this proportionality argument also. Licensing is a bad word, but you have a driving license, right? So many, all of us have a driving license. Millions of driving licenses are issued. The cost of issuing driving license to the government is very high. What is the total insurance cost of private vehicle ownership? How many thousand crores would it be? Total cost of insurance business, right? So what happens if we abolish the license and we say that the insurance, okay, will be borne by the government or whatever? Now, if you start comparing the harm in quantifiable monetary terms, you realize that 300 crores are the reported losses to people from frauds that are done using telecom services per month, reported to Reserve Bank of India. And worldwide studies show that only 10% are reported. So this could be 3,000 crores per month. That's 30,000 crores, 36,000 crores per annum. What are we talking about? Regulatory burden and cost of compliance and all that. Any number compares to 36,000 crores of harm? No, it doesn't. So let's look at what the harm is. Let's debate it. I'm saying let's not close our minds to debate. Let's debate it. Let's understand it. And as I see it, I'm very happy that the debate is not closed. If it was closed, then that will be a bad thing. See, I was in a situation, I must confess. Mr. Rupal knows, we even had a conversation. Should OTT be regulated came up as a question, as a reference from from DOT. I was in TRAI at that time. I did a consultation on this, collected all the answers, lots of answers, lots of debate, thousands of pages of text and arguments that people had given. I couldn't decide that, or recommend to the authority that you do it like this or you do it like that. We only said now is not the opportune moment. Maybe we should look at it at some stage. Didn't close it one way or the other. And I believe that if we would have closed it one way or the other, either way it would have been a harm. Either way it would have been a harm. So there are many things in this law. And Pragya mentioned biometric. Yes, it's good to do good KYC. But if biometrics and KYC, robust KYC, could eliminate fraud, then why do we have fraud? Because banks have got KYC, no? Banks have Aadhaar linked accounts and banks have PAN card also. They have your photograph. They take your fingerprints on the form. They have all kinds of authorizations. The banking industry loses this money, no? There is no way an arm can come out of your laptop and get into your pocket. It goes to your bank account, which has biometric link to it. And that hasn't made it possible to eliminate. I'm saying, okay, not eliminate, but at least catch the fellow who gets away with the money. You are not able to catch the person. So just having robust KYC, good biometrics is not going to solve the problem. That is a very simplified way of looking at things, and we should not have simplified way of looking at things. Innovation comes when you realize what the beast is, what the problem is, and you innovate. That is what innovation means, right? So innovation means understanding the problem. Innovation means understanding the problem in a way that has not been understood in the past, not by imposing a preconceived construct and saying that this is what it should be. Because like I mentioned in the beginning, if the decisions were there and clarity was there in the bill and we didn't like that clarity, what would we do? What would we do? At least the door is open, and at least we should be discussing it. We should be thinking about it. We should be owning the responsibility of diminishing that harm which does exist today. The thousands of crores are being lost. What are we doing about it to collectively to reduce it? In Singapore, there is a new regulation which the financial services sector and the telecom are bringing together, and they are saying that if there is money lost, we want to know whether the first person in line is the bank. They have to pay unless they can demonstrate that they have done everything that was possible to do in that case, and they are blameless. Then it goes to telecom. They have to prove that everything that they could possibly do, they have done, and only then residual responsibility will be with risk, not responsibility. Residual risk remains with the account holder. Okay. So others are also creatively thinking about it. They are also fixing responsibility on some of those sectors. And I think if we look at solutions, there will be no need to regulate. There will be no need to regulate. When we talk of end-to-end encryption, we forget. We think of WhatsApp and security of communication, yes, but we forget that WhatsApp was not end-to-end encrypted in the beginning. It was clear text. It was an innovation they brought in to make it end-to-end encrypted, right? And I don't see that there is a huge cost of compliance involved in this, or that you have to weaken the end-to-end encryption or any such thing. Those are not the requirements. Nobody should be asking for weaker encryption. I mean, that has no meaning. If the encryption is weaker, everybody can attack it. We don't want to have. We don't want to go there. So what do we want to do is the question, and that's what this discussion and debate is about. I think if it has to be constructive, that is what we need to look at. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. And I think it makes the moderator's job very easy when there's a provocative intervention. I have two hands up, Pragya and then Rishu. Over to you guys. Yeah.
I completely agree, with Sunilji on this. I think my point of, just talking about verification was that at least it's a step in the right direction. I don't think it's a solve, I think we've seen that scam and fraud, because that's an area which Truecaller obviously works a lot in. It's a very complex problem, and so I mean I think you will just need a separate panel to just really talk about that and what are some of the measures that the industry, civil society, government, law enforcement agencies all together can do to solve this problem, because understanding the nuances, and there's also not just about verification, or it's not just about suspicious links, it's not about calling, it's also about social engineering, it's all about people actually giving their own OTPs voluntarily. And then what does a bank do? Then what does a law enforcement body do? How do they really legitimize saying you shared that OTP with the scamster? Yes, okay, now you say that you've lost the money, but how do we know it was not a legitimate transaction, right? So I think that there's a lot of complexities in that problem. And so I think, like I said, we can have a separate dialogue on this, but the only reason why I brought it up is at least they're thinking about what that should be. Is that maybe one of the solves, along with many other layers that you need to load up to solve the fraud problem? Yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Pragya. I think Bishu, you had your hand up, and after that, it's Dr. Rupal.
We
Bishu,
can't hear you.
Yeah. You're on mute.
We can't hear you.
All right, is it better?
Yeah.
No, I kind of echo Pragya's sentiments as well on this, right? Like it's going to be sort of a labyrinth, and that's exactly what I said from an implementation and technology perspective, right? It's very interesting to see how the players enter. So the players entering it, as Dr. Pal said, yes, there are already players there in the telecom sector, but then there are going to be a host of ancillary services around data protection, around newer technology stacks that would come in. There could be blockchain, there could be AI, any of these. How you keep data secure, how do you prevent tampering, how do you prevent identity theft, because everybody's supposed to give out data, and that data is to be securely stored, processed, and stored. Now there's also the problem of scale. We talk about proliferation, right? Which is why I said financial inclusion is a very interesting case study to see this. As and when you go across the country, you go to the smaller towns and villages and say, okay, let's reach out to more and more people, make this more commonplace. The technology has to scale. So yes, probably a lot of ancillary solutions, products, and business lines are going to come out of this, where existing or novel solutions would probably be ended up using, right? The third part around again, what Pragya said, what do you do and whose liability is it if somebody is scammed, right? That's very much correct. So if you look at again fintech, right, with digital finance becoming more and more commonplace, if you look at it, there are a lot of awareness campaigns that are run on various media, right? The same will have to be done here as well, because just like data privacy laws or GDPR in EU, until unless people really know what they are supposed to, not supposed to, what are the best practices and guidelines over a period, without awareness, any law that is created will obviously be, any solution that's created will always have a human element, right? So this becomes which is why I said the implementation becomes a very, very interesting facet for me as a technocrat, because there's the scale, there's the technology, and then there's the human element. All three of them coming together, it becomes a very eclectic mix. All three.
Thanks. Dr. Rupal, you also had your hands up.
Yes. I hope you can hear me. Yeah. So, it's subject for a longer discussion, but I'd say this, that one would normally expect legislation to be enabling. And the job, for example, the point that Sunil Ji and Pragya and Rishu have made is that the issues are complex. The issues have multiple solutions with different emphases and this and that. And this is precisely why we need and we have regulators. Regulators' job is not to say yes, no, but to say how much. What is the most appropriate response to the set of conditions that we have? So what we are, I think, goofing up here in the legislation is that we are actually including many things which actually should belong in the regulatory space and typically do. For example, let me give you
not the best of places.
Rishu, can you
But-
put yourself on mute?
Yeah. So the, for example, take something like auction. Now, I would expect the enabling law to say that the government is committed to, for instance, transparent allocation of natural resources such as spectrum, and then leave it to the regulator to decide based on market conditions, based on technology conditions, as to what the most appropriate way of allocation of spectrum might be at a given time. And this thing might change because we are talking about an environment that is changing at a phenomenal speed. So to straitjacket regulators by saying that they must auction, or to say that they must authorize, and so on and so forth, or for that is a problem. So I think most of these decisions that we are talking about, most of the provisions we are talking about, are not on-off decisions. They are not, allowed, disallowed, permitted, and forbidden kind of decisions. And that is why we need competent, independent regulatory bodies. And this is the time when you need them most. And unfortunately, we are trying to do something in a ham-headed way, in my view, by including regulatory issues in the legislation, which actually, in my very humble opinion, would actually cause a lot of problems, because we are, and indeed, that's exactly what happened with the Supreme Court judgment on spectrum. It actually solved the problem then, but created bigger problems afterwards. That now we have to, now we need to change the law. But if you had an enabling law which said that, look, we want transparent, competitively neutral ways of allocating spectrum, the regulators would have taken a call on how exactly that is to be ensured. So just a limited point that we need an enabling legislation, and then competent, independent regulators who can respond to the situation as it develops. And that is their job. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Pragyan, then Mr. Vajpayee. That's the order.
Yeah, so I think, to Rishu's point around awareness, right? I think we've been doing a bunch of things around that, which is we've been doing our on-ground trainings, and we've gone and done that in about 8 states in the country, and done trainings with law enforcement, local administration, just basically to get this message out for people to know what are some of the kind of MOs that scamsters are using in order to, have you send their money, have them send your money to them. I think the more recent ones were around the festivities, right? Where you suddenly are getting an airport for 5,000 rupees, and people tend to click on that link and think that they're getting a very sweet deal. So obviously if a deal is too good to be true, it's actually not true. So, I think there are awareness campaigns that we're running, but I think, the challenge with that is a lot of the messaging, even that, that regulators are putting out. So, for example, RBI, I4C, all of even the government agencies are putting out a lot of this information on their social media platforms to reach as many people as possible with this message. But a lot of the messaging still is around don't share your OTP. The fact is that, yes, we know how not to share our OTP, but if somebody on the other side is claiming to be your father or your mother or your relative or your friend or your grandmother who's not reached out to you for years and suddenly now calls you and says she needs money, the tendency is to go out and share that OTP. And I think, therefore, a lot of the transitioning now in the awareness needs to be around social engineering, how it's, creating, how fraudsters are getting smarter and they're getting ahead of the game way quicker than we are. And therefore, I think a little bit of regulation around this is certainly going to be helpful, but more with the lens of what are we doing to, what Dr. Uppal was saying, to be more future ready on this aspect. But I don't think the telecom bill alone can solve this. So I think, therefore, this requires a much more deeper debate, but it's certainly a problem which requires a lot of attention. And I think the government has started to do, at least we are seeing a lot of the collaboration taking place, whether that's with I4C or with DOT along this. And they've been very open for industries, companies like ourselves or private players or tech platforms to come in and participate and allow for information flow to happen obviously within the framework of privacy and terms of service and privacy policy of all our platforms, but make sure that it's a more collaborative approach, because the fraudsters are moving at a much faster pace than we are to solve this challenge.
Sure, thanks. Over to you, Mr. Bajpai.
Thank you. I couldn't figure out how to raise hand in this interface, so I had to physically raise hand. But I want to actually, for no other reason but emphasis, repeat what Mr. Mahesh Uppal said. He brought out that the regulators has a role to play, and that legislators should not play that role. That is a very nuanced argument and is likely to be missed. So I just want to clarify that the regulator plays all three roles. It's an adjudicator. It makes rules, subordinate legislation, right? It imposes penalties. So it's also an enforcement mechanism. It's all three in one: the legislator, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, all in one. And it is necessary to create a regulator, because where there is fast changing market, neither of these three mechanisms will be able to function. Right? Laws take time to change and make. Judicial decisions, very deliberate process, and we want it to be deliberate, takes time. Market changes in weeks, right? So you need a regulator to regulate the market using each of these three mechanisms. So it must use these mechanisms to create and maintain a market, and let the market deliver the outcomes that you're trying to. So when a regulator works well, it does all these three things in a little measure, sets up a market, the market solves the problem. Innovation and competition in the market solves the problem. Most problems can be addressed in this manner if we think through how we are solving this problem. And therefore, he is very articulate himself, but I thought I must take some time to reiterate what he said, because it's such an important point. Now, two other points I'd like to make about education. Rishu made that point, Pragya made that point. Everybody agrees that people should be educated. But let me ask a question. The more you educate, the more you increase anxiety in the population. Everybody is telling me that be careful, don't share this, don't share that, your account may be blocked, you may have lost money, this may have happened, that may have happened. I hear 10 such messages every day. Then a very friendly voice pops up and says that, you know what, your account is getting blocked. Oh God, I had got this warning 20 times in last month, one month, what did I do? And he executes it. Anxiety is the fuel that a scammer uses. That anxiety may be a good anxiety, I'm getting a good job, I'm getting a very good deal, or bad anxiety that something is going wrong. The scammer will use that fact. Therefore, if we can create some tools which take away the need for education, and to some extent, and create those tools which will take care of that burden that is there. Pragya made the point that what happens if I have actually scammed the bank. I collaborate with her, I give her the money by sharing that OTP, and then and tell the bank that she has run away with that money, now give me my money back. Can happen, right? But it can happen in real life otherwise also, without banking and online transactions. I can always claim that this is the money that I had. I was going there, and somebody came at the knife point, has stolen it from me, and make a complaint. I can always make such a complaint. What will the police do? And if you think that people don't make false complaints, think about the insurance business that we talked about in cars, private motor vehicle. So many false insurance claims get made. In healthcare, false insurance claims get made that this happened, that happened. It is investigated. It's found to be wrong. It is disallowed, right? So it's not a new problem. The point I'm making is it's not a new problem. To discover the truth is important. At least online, you have some online traces. Some authorization was done, some sequence must have happened, some OTP did go, right? In this matter of OTP, what is the OTP for? OTP is to be used. It must be shared. You can't keep the OTP with yourself. You have to give the OTP to either a website, but usually not to a person. Okay, but it happens. The guy who comes to your home for taking a blood sample. I mean, this is an example that happened today with me. He came for a blood sample. He says your name is wrong in the request. Therefore, I'm rescheduling it, and you will get an OTP. Share the OTP with me. I gave him the OTP because he has to correct my name in the report. So did I not give an OTP to a human being? I did. Credentials, passwords, they have to be provided to the right agent. Then only you get the service. Okay. The problem happens that it's difficult to tell who's the right agent and who's the wrong agent. And that problem is a more fundamental problem than don't share your OTP, don't share your credentials. You see, Aristotle said that human beings are social animals, right? He went on to say more. He said only the hermit can be divorced from other people. I don't know what words he used. That if you can be either a crook or you have to be a hermit. Then you can stay away from other people. Otherwise, you have to interact. If we have to be part of society, and if we have to do things easily, if we have to do the transactions, if we have to do work, e-commerce, all that is being built, we have to be able to use these services. Now, one more point that I want to make before shutting up. Who's the biggest beneficiary of online transactions and fintech and everything? I would say banks. Their cost of operations has gone down. They don't need so many people. They don't need to open branches. I don't go to a bank at all. Everything happens online. All that happens online is some data records get changed, right? Who has benefited the most from this? My bank interest rates have remained the same from the time this was fully manually delivered service to today. Okay. Who has benefited? And how have the banks compensated or paid for, if I may use the word, to improve the security of those services which they have used to make their services more efficient? They can't pass on the burden of negative impacts to the customer or to somebody else and say that efficiency gains, we must do this, password free accounting, don't need to do anything, just touch and done. I like it, they like it, but then we need to make it secure. They have a role to play, all of us have a role to play, and therefore we must think about the problem. Pragya mentioned a very valid point. This is a very complex problem, fraud, etc. Harm in general. I'm not talking of fraud alone. I mean, the entire state can be attacked through the telecom network. I mean, your infrastructure, everything is open, is connected. So it's far more than just few hundred crores per month. It's the entire infrastructure of the society. Your nuclear stations can be attacked through the same network, right? So there are reasons to debate this, to understand where and what we are doing from each of our lenses, and then come to a conclusion as to where we are headed or what we should do. Thanks.
Great, thanks. I think we just have 10 more minutes and I want to open the queue for audience. Do we have any questions?
We don't have any questions as of now. Isha, if you have anything else to
Right.
ask, we can go ahead with that.
All right.
And if you have any questions, I'll share them.
Perfect. But if anybody from the audience hasn't posted their question in the chat and want to raise their hand and speak, even that can be facilitated. There is a question from Krishank. He writes, has the government overlooked a chance to improve surveillance and suspension reform? God. And how will these new provisions affect people's civil liberties and privacy? Anybody wants to take this one up?
Well, I think this is a political question rather than a legal question. How will it happen? What will happen? It depends on what you want to do. The same laws can be administered in very different ways, right? Laws do not define everything about the country or society or anything, right? So the what will happen in future? God only knows what will happen in future, and what can be used for what purpose? It depends on who you are asking, right? So it's a very difficult question. It's asking for a prediction into future. I think that's why the panelists are quiet. You know. Anyway, I made an attempt of sort.
Right, nice.
They are not.
Dr. Uppal, yeah, I think he wants to
I know.
also.
Just to be contrary, it's unrealistic to think that this is how surveillance reform or privacy protection would have taken place. I think those measures have to be taken elsewhere, and the act by itself, it would be unrealistic to think would actually reform those two. So that's where I'm coming from. But yes, I think as I mentioned earlier, are the safeguards adequate? I would say no. And so in that sense, we haven't improved the situation, but left it as it is.
Sure, I think that helps clarify a lot. Anybody else has any question? All right, and I'm going to take my moderator's prerogative. There was one question that we sort of didn't go to. Mr. Vajpayee alluded to the encryption sort of conversation happening. Another sort of critique that one has heard, and I specifically want to pose it to Rishu because you've clearly identified as a technocrat amidst the group. How do you read some of these provisions, especially on national security standards, notifying standards? Do you think it will have an impact on encryption as some of the technologists are sort of talking about?
So, like I said, if I have to look at it on the impact, some of this technology may warrant a relook on how it is implemented today and what needs to be done. Like I said, if for instance, I'm just taking an example. If you have to store customer information in a non-tampered, secure way that nobody can come and alter it without permission, you can use blockchain, for example. A lot of banks already use blockchain for ledgers, right? And that just means immutable information. So it means if somebody visits Sunil and says your name is wrong, but then that would reflect almost everywhere, right? It's not something that someone can go tamper it and say, oh, you know, your name is wrong. I would like to have your real information. So yes, again, complex problems will arise out of this as and when we go deeper and deeper on what these laws mean. What does encryption mean, and what does it even mean to have? Are you going to have a one-way encryption or two-way encryption? For example, one-way encryption is once you encrypt it, you can't do anything about it. What does it mean for anonymity? How those implementations will end up happening? Like I said, like if you look at, like Dr. Pal said, if you look at EU and if you look at how GDPR and other privacy laws were done, it was not a very easy route, right? Eventually, you had to put its foot down and say, hey, look, everybody has to do it. Even today, there are enough lawsuits going on in those courts against big tech where they have knowingly, unknowingly violated some of those rules. It's a complex thing with some mixture of legalese. Technology becomes a tool for it. And like I said, as and when telecommunications has more and more proliferation, there is also going to be the question of scale. Some of the technologies that are being used today will not stand that test of scale and will need again a relook. So yeah, we are in for very interesting times from a technology perspective on these problems.
anybody else wants to come in on the encryption sort of conversations?
Yes, yes. Very interesting points that he made, all very valid. Encryption, especially, interestingly, if you you can use quantum entanglement to transfer a key, right? Very secure way of transferring keys, and that is not subject to this law because it's not electromagnetic transmission. So you can actually do a determination of key on both sides and argue that this is not electromagnetic and therefore is outside. This key transfer is okay. But I mean, quite apart from such far out ideas, the the encryption bit is a tough thing to tackle. Blockchain does help in immutability, but doesn't prevent harm or fraud. We have seen biggest scams have happened involving crypto. So crypto has been used for scam. A job offer led to $500 million worth of crypto assets being stolen from an exchange. It's the same scam that we hear every day. You got a job, right? It's just that that job offer was meant for a engineer in a crypto exchange, and he fell for it, and they lost $500 million. So crypto by itself will not prevent fraud. It is a problem that is more complex. Okay, it is one of the tools that we must use. It's a great technology, just like quantum is or quantum cryptography is. We must use it. Maybe zero knowledge proof protocols should be introduced. High time that we did that. So if we use all these kind of tools, this is next couple of decades of work already lined up for innovation and technology. So that brings us back to the question: is innovation going to be dead? No, I agree with my friend Mahesh Uppal that innovation is alive and kicking and will go on. I see Rishu has figured out how to raise hands, so let him make it.
Go ahead, Rishu. You have 30 seconds, literally.
No, I like the blockchain example because if you look at fraud detection and blockchain, that in itself has become an industry now with multiple players, right? And that is exactly what I meant when I said ancillary business lines and product lines and solutions are going to come up. There are going to be a host of problems that will be identified. Somebody is going to be try to solve them using technology, and that's where a lot of innovation, a lot of new stuff is going to now start happening around us. So that is what, again, as a technocrat, I would look forward to how some of these problems are solved. I know Pragya is solving some of those problems already as we speak, but yeah, I'm sure that a lot of new things are also going to come to the fore now.
All right. Thank you. I think we're almost at time. Unfortunately, we'll not have time for everyone's closing remarks. Please don't hold that against me. Before just signing off, I wanted to quickly, I don't think I can summarize what each one of you said. That's not something I'd be particularly good at. But thank you. And I think what I clearly take away a couple of things. One is how Mr. Bajpai just said, right? Like debate is important and discussion is important. And I'm glad that we at least are doing that and accommodating various new points. And I hope the door for incorporating some of these suggestions remain open. And I think that's what at least take away from this discussion should be, that how do we then make sure that whatever we're saying or talking here gets translated into policy and rules. And secondly, Dr. Uppal said questions will never go away. Of course not, questions will never go away. But I do hope that people who joined in also find it as novel and refreshing as I found it, because a lot of the discussions that one's reading about tend to be one-sided or singularly focused. And I hope we've been able to eke out or tease out some other facets that probably are as fresh for the others as they are for me. And thank you, lastly, for the copious amount of notes I've made. You clearly made my job easier of analyzing the bill once January kicks in. So thanks on a personal front as well. Thank you, Anvesha, for giving me this opportunity. And over to you now to close the room.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here and for your time. This was a very insightful conversation. And like Isha as well, I will also be writing a summary of the discussion here, and which will be out on the website as well for others to read from. And yeah, thank you very much. I hope all of you enjoy the rest of your Friday evening and the rest of the year.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody. And all the best.
Bye.
Bye, Rishu. Bye. Bye, Sunil ji.